Salvete discipuli, hodie spectatis lecturam ūndēvigesimam, the perfect passive system, plus interrogative pronouns and adjectives. Hodie discemus primum vocabula capitis ūndēvigenti, dende grammaticam. We will learn the perfect passive system today, okay, covering the perfect passive tense, the pluperfect passive, and the future perfect passive. Okay, so you have all of these tenses in the active, now you'll get them in the passive. Plus we'll learn interrogatives, both the interrogative pronouns quis, quid, and the adjectives qui, quae, quod. And if those look like relative pronouns, that's right, and they decline the same way, so it's not so bad. Primum discemus verba vocabulorum capitis ūndēvigenti. In hoc capite sunt tria verba, delecto, libero, paro. Delecto, delectare, delectavi, delectatum est primum verbum. Ego a felibus delector. A quibus animalibus vos delectamini? Canibus, leporibus, quoque felibus. Quid significat delecto? Ecce ego, ecce feles. Ego a felibus delector. Proximum verbum, libero, liberare, liberavi, liberatum. Ad finem secundi belli mondialis, Lutetia, urbs capitalis Franco-Gallicorum, liberata est. Quid significat libero? Ecce arcus triumphalis, ecce Carolos de Gaulle. Quid significat libero? Ultimum verbum, paro, parare, paravi, paratum. Si vis pacem, para bellum. Quid significat paro? Nunc discemus nomina vocabulorum capitis ūndēvigenti. In hoc capite sunt quinque nomina: auctor, beneficium, iudex, iudicium, scellus. Primum nomen, auctor, auctoris. Numa Pompilius, ille rex antiquus, fuit auctor religionis Romanae. Quid significat auctor? Proximum nomen, beneficium, beneficii. Beneficium duobus senibus datum est a viro, qui umbrellam tenet. Quid significat beneficium? Proxima nomina, iudex iudicis, et iudicium iudicii. Iudicia a iudicibus iudicantur. Quid significant iudex et iudicium? Ecce iudex. Iudex est homo qui iudicia iudicat. Quid significant nomina? Ultimum nomen, scellus, scelleris. Sub imperio eius, multa scellera ab imperatore Caligula, qui hostis generis humani appellatus est, facta sunt. Quid significat scellus? Nunc discemus adjectiva vocabulorum capitis ūndēvigenti. In hoc capite sunt Duo adjectiva, certus, gravis. Primum adjectivum, certus, certa, certum. Duo sola sunt certa, quae sunt mors et tributa. Quid significat certus? Ultimum adjectivum, gravis, grave. Liber qui a Leone Tolstoio scriptus est, et ballum et pax appellator, liber gravis de rebus gravibus est. Quid significat gravis? Nunc discemus alias partes loquendi vocabulorum capitis ūndēviginti. In hoc capite sunt unum adverbium, iam, et una praepositio, contra. Primum et ultimum adverbium, iam. Iam paene december anni 2000 viginti quinque est. Tempus fugit. Quid significat iam? Prima et ultima praepositio, contra. In tertio pello punico, quod a Romanis contra Carthaginienses pugnatum est, urbs Carthago deleta est. Quid significat contra? Contra plus casum accusativum. Okay, today's a fun day because we're going to learn the perfect passive, and this is going to really throw you for a loop, but I'll try my best to make this as clear as possible, and of course we will work with this for the rest of the semester well into the next one. So, remember all those principal parts and how you're supposed to memorize them from the get-go, even if you're not going to use all of them? Well, here's the day where we're now going to use the fourth and final one that we haven't really used yet. Okay, and that is for the perfect passive system. Okay, so let's look at a verb with all four principal parts: capio, capere, capi, captum, to capture, to take, to seize, whatever. Okay, so we learned that the first principal parts for that present system, okay, present, future, imperfect. Okay, the second principal part also helps with that. It's the active infinitive. Capi, the third principal parts for that perfect system, the perfect active system, that is, okay, for the perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect. Okay, captum is for the perfect passive system. Okay, it is technically called the perfect passive participle, and we'll tell you more about what that means. So, how do you form verbs in the perfect passive? Well, you take that fourth principal part, okay, and you turn it into a 2-1-2 adjective. Okay, so you take captum, okay, and you take that case ending looking thing, and you treat it as a 2-1-2 ending. Okay, and why are you turning this verb element into an adjective, you ask? Well, that's because it is a participle, and a participle is an adjective that is formed from a verb. And as an adjective, it is going to take on the gender, okay, of its subject. Okay? So not only will it take on the gender, but as an adjective, it'll also take its number and case. Okay? That case will often be nominative because it's the subject of the verb, right? And the number will, of course, be singular or plural, depending on what you need. Okay? And then you add sum as an auxiliary verb. Okay? So here's a couple examples. Well, here's kind of your basic examples in all three tenses of the perfect system that you put in the passive. Okay, so first let's look at the perfect passive. Captus sum means I was captured. Okay, so remember, this is the perfect tense, so it describes a completed action in the past. But as opposed to the perfect active, where you would say I captured or I have captured, it describes the subject, a completed action happening to the subject, or the subject receiving a completed action in the past. So I was captured, I have been captured. Captus sum. Okay? So notice how we have that participle, okay, which means having been captured by itself, plus the verb to be. And this is called an auxiliary verb. And we use these a lot in English, right? We use is and has, etc., had, right, a lot when we make verb tenses in English. Well, Latin does that in this situation. Okay, captus sum, I was captured. Okay, it literally says I am having been captured. Okay, which functionally means I was captured. The pluperfect passive is the same thing, it's just a different auxiliary verb, captus eram, I had been captured. Okay, so a completed action further in the past that the subject has received or had received. Okay, and you use the imperfect of the verb to be with the participle, which of course will still agree with the subject. I'm using us here because I'm referring to myself, okay, a man, one person. And then the future perfect passive, captus ero, I will have been captured, okay, describing a completed action in the future that the subject will have received, captus ero. So that's just the participle plus the future of the verb to be, okay? So hopefully that's pretty straightforward. Let's see how this works. Okay, so again, the perfect passive can be translated either as I was verbed or I have been verbed, right? The subject received a completed action in the past. Okay? So again, fourth principal part turned into a participle plus the present indicative of sum. Okay, so if you can conjugate sum in the present, okay, and you know your 2-on-2 engines, you can form the perfect passive just fine. Okay, and again, that participle is functionally an adjective, so it has to agree with the subject like an adjective. Okay, now, even though the helping verb is sum, you want to translate that as I am or etc. However, don't be tempted to translate a perfect passive as I am verbed, because that's the present passive. What you're literally saying is I am having been verbed, okay, which denotes a past action. Okay, let's see the difference. Now, let's review the present passive. Okay, remember in the present passive, you're using the present system off of those first two principal parts. So amor, amaris, amator, amamor, amamini, amantor. So I am being loved, you're being loved, he, she, it's being loved, we're being loved, y'all are being loved, they're being loved. Okay, so again, the subjects here are receiving in the present the action of loving. Let's switch over to the perfect passive, where the subject received the action of loving in the past. Okay, and notice that when I conjugate a perfect passive, I actually have to specify the gender of my subject. Okay, because it has that participle, and that participle is an adjective that needs to agree with the subject in gender, case, and number, right? In this situation, masculine nominative. Okay, so when I have you on tests and quizzes, right, conjugate a perfect passive verb or a verb in the perfect passive system, I will actually have to specify for you what the gender of the subject is. Okay, so amatus sum. Okay, I have been loved, right? Or I was loved. Okay, literally I am having been loved. Okay, a past action. Okay, so again, amo, amare, amawi, amatum. I took amatum, the fourth principal part of amo. Okay, I cut off the added a 2-on-2 ending. Okay, agreeing with the subject, in this case, a dude, right? So, amatus sum, I was loved. Amatus es, you were loved. Amatus est, he, she, it was loved. Amati sumus, we were loved. Okay, notice that when the subject switches to plural, okay, so do the case endings of the participle, amati sumus. Now we're in the masculine plural nominative as opposed to the masculine singular nominative because the subject's plural, amati sumus. Okay, we were loved. Amati estis, y'all were loved. Amati sunt, they were loved. Okay? All right, what about the pluperfect passive? Okay, this translates as I had been loved. So this works the exact same way as the perfect passive, except you swap out the present of the verb to be as your helping verb and swap in the imperfect indicative of the verb to be as your helping verb. Okay, and of course the participle is still going to agree with the subject. So let's compare side by side the perfect passive with a masculine subject to the pluperfect passive with a feminine subject. Okay, so again, in the perfect passive, I specify a masculine subject, and so I have the present of the verb to be with my participle, my fourth principal part, okay, with the masculine 2-1-2 endings. Let's look over on the right here to the pluperfect passive. Okay, this time I'm specifying a feminine subject. Okay, and so if you look at those case endings of the perfect passive participle here, okay, they are in the feminine singular and plural nominative, amata eram, etc. Okay, and notice instead of sum, I have eram. So I'm literally saying I was having been loved, okay, which functionally means I had been loved. Amata eram, I had been loved. Amata eras, you had been loved. And when I'm talking to you, you're a woman. Amata erat, okay, she had been loved. Okay, I don't even have to say he, she, it here. I can just say she had been loved. Just like with amatus est, I can say he had been loved, and that's it. I know the gender of the subject just from the verb. Isn't that nice? Okay, amatai eramus. Okay, we had been loved. Amatai eratis, y'all had been loved. Amatai arant, they had been loved. Again, this is just taking a bunch of familiar stuff and recombining it in new ways, okay, to do something new. Isn't it nice when it works that way, okay? And by now, you figured out that the future perfect passive functions accordingly, okay? So I will have been loved. Remember, the future perfect describes a future action that is talked about as being complete. I will have gone to the store, etc. Okay? So again, just like the perfect passive and pluperfect passive, you're taking that participle and that fourth principal part, you're turning it into a 2-1-2 adjective, okay, and you are supplying whatever endings agree with your subject. Okay? So let's look on the right here. The future perfect passive, I'm now just specifying a neuter subject, okay, which means the singular endings of the participle will be and the plural endings will be a short a, right, because it's neuter. So amatum ero, I'm speaking as if I'm a neuter subject, okay? I am a thing right now, okay? Amatum ero, I will have been loved. Amatum eris, you will have been loved. Amatum erit, it will have been loved. Okay, again, I can say it here, okay, because the subject's neuter. Okay, switch to the plural. Amata erimus, we neuter things, will have been loved. Okay, it's like Toy Story, right? Amata eritis, okay, y'all will have been loved. Amata erunt, okay, they will have been loved. Okay, so again, most important thing is that those participle endings, okay, will function like adjectival case endings to agree with the subject and gender, case, and number. Okay. Now you're asking yourself, that's a lot of stuff, okay? Why is this chapter being so evil and introducing yet another thing in addition to this new kind of set of verb tenses? And oh God, we're learning even more pronouns. How many bloody pronouns are there? Thankfully, interrogative pronouns and adjectives are pretty much already familiar at this point. They're just being used as a different function, okay? So what do we mean by interrogative pronouns? Well, interrogative means asking questions, right? Think of an interrogation, right? So our interrogative pronouns are as follows. Here's some examples that use them in various cases and genders for that matter. Okay, so interrogative pronouns are question words, okay? Words like who, whose, whom, and what, okay? Asked as a question, right? And they're pronouns because they stand on themselves and there's no noun there that it is in the sentence that is agreeing with. It's just by itself, hence a pronoun. So, who is the first emperor? Quis fuit primus imperator? Whose cat is this? Genitive. Cuius feles est? To whom am I speaking? Cui dico. What do you desire for dinner? Quid cenare desideras? Okay? Interrogative adjectives are similar. They're used to ask questions. However, as adjectives, they are agreeing with an explicit noun in the sentence. In other words, there is a noun there that it is agreeing with. Okay? So, which emperor was the first? Qui imperator fuit primus. Okay? Notice that it's agreeing with a stated noun, whereas quis in the previous example is just a pronoun by itself. And notice that it looks different. The pronoun looks different in that situation. Okay, which lady's cat is this? Cujus feminae feles est. Notice that cujus here, okay, is the same. However, it is agreeing with feminae here. To which man am I speaking? Cui viro dico. Same thing. What kind of pasta do you desire? Quod genus pastae desideros. Okay, and notice here that quid and quod look different. Okay, so there are some differences between what interrogative pronouns and interrogative adjectives in certain situations, but most of them, they look identical. Well, what do they look like? So let's start with declining interrogative pronouns. Let's look at the singular here. Okay, notice that it just goes nominative through ablative here. There's no vocative. And if you look at the singular on the left, you'll notice that the interrogative pronoun is identical if you are referring to either a masculine or feminine referent. Okay, quis, cujus, cui, quem, quo. Gee, that looks a lot like the relative pronoun, and that's no coincidence. Okay, think about English. Okay, words like who and which and whose and whom. Okay, those are relative pronouns in English, but they are also interrogative pronouns. Okay, just as we saw from the examples in the previous slide. Okay, so of course, in Latin, it's similar. The interrogative pronouns will look very similar to the relative pronouns. Okay, with some key differences. So quis in the nominative and quid here for the neuter, right? Those are different than qui, quae, quod in the relative pronouns. So there's a few differences there. Okay. So, but then let's look at the plural. Guess what? The plural relative pronouns, the plural interrogative pronouns are identical to the relative pronouns. Completely identical. Okay, so it's just a matter of context and usage. Usually your example sentence will have a question mark in it, okay, to help you out, to tell the difference between a relative pronoun and an interrogative pronoun. Also, if there's no relative clause, but you see a pronoun like this, well, you're probably dealing with an interrogative. Okay, and here's the best part. Interrogative adjectives are identical to relative pronouns, identical in every way. Okay, so it's just a matter of context and usage to determine how they're functioning. Okay, that's it. So it is really in your best interest to memorize all of these QU words, the relative and interrogative pronouns and adjectives. Okay, because they're used a lot. You know, in English certainly in Latin as well. Okay, so really get to know these. You'll probably expect these on an upcoming declension paradigm on an assessment. Okay, and that's it, I think. Oh, I just did this slide again, just go back and again to reinforce the differences, okay, between interrogative and interrogative adjectives. Again, interrogative pronouns stand by themselves. Okay, they have some slightly unique forms like quis and quid in the nominative, or in this case, the accusative because it's neuter. Whereas interrogative adjectives, they are always agreeing with an explicit noun, okay, and they look identical to relative pronouns, okay, so it's just a matter of context. Okay, hopefully that's not so bad, and I'll see you next time. Oleti discipli.